Hey everyone, gotta give a big shout out to Lit RPG Reads and Paul Bello, fine fellow indeed, for sending this awesome article over. It's all about homebrewing D&D rules, around food and exhaustion. And I am so ready for this. I mean, just the other week, my group, we were doing this whole pirate campaign, and we got shipwrecked, totally deserted island.
Yeah.
And we're all like, no problem, we're seasoned adventurers. But turns out surviving on like coconuts and the occasional, giant crab, it can really wear a party down. Let me tell you, we were making some pretty desperate choices by like day 3.
Oh, yeah. That's exactly the kind of scenario that this article really dives into, like how these mechanics, food and exhaustion, they can become these gripping elements that kind of shape your whole game. It really hammers home the point that these mechanics can be way more than just checking a box on your character sheet.
Right.
They can really amp up the narrative and make every decision feel weighty.
Okay, so walk me through this.
Yeah.
How does the article suggest we actually implement these homebrew rules?
Okay.
Because I'm already picturing all these complications and rulebook debates mid-game.
Yeah.
Well, the beauty is it offers a pretty flexible framework that dungeon masters can adapt to their own style. It breaks down the mechanics into 4 key categories: resource management survival challenges, role-playing opportunities, and tension building.
All right, I'm intrigued. Let's break those down one by one. Resource management, that's got to be the foundation, right?
Absolutely. Think about it. On a long journey, how much food can your party realistically carry? What happens when those rations start running low? This is where you can get really creative with foraging rules. Maybe even introduce weight limits for different types of food.
Ooh, weight limits. That's a fun wrinkle I hadn't thought of. Suddenly those heavy iron rations don't sound so appealing when you're trekking through a jungle.
Exactly. It forces your players to think strategically about what they pack and how they manage their supplies. Now let's talk about survival challenges. This is where the environment comes into play. Think about the different types of terrain and the unique challenges they present.
Like crossing a scorched desert, where water is more valuable than gold. Or navigating a frozen wasteland where every step saps your strength.
You got it. Those are prime examples of how you can use these mechanics to create a truly immersive experience. Now imagine the role-playing potential in those situations.
Oh man, that's where things get juicy, right?
Exactly. Imagine your party huddled around a meager fire, sharing their last scraps of food, or maybe even arguing over who gets the warmest cloak. These rules can really bring out those moments of camaraderie, desperation, and even conflict within the party.
Okay, so far so good.
Yeah.
We've got players carefully rationing their jerky, shivering in the snow, and maybe starting to eye each other suspiciously. What's next?
Tension building. This is where the survival mechanics can really ratchet up the stakes of your game. Every decision about when to press forward, when to rest, when to risk a foraging expedition, it all carries weight.
Because failure could mean starvation, exhaustion, or even worse, right? That's a whole different level of pressure than your average dungeon crawl.
Precisely. It makes every encounter more meaningful and every victory feel hard-earned. But, as the article wisely points out, there's a fine line between challenge and frustration.
Right, we don't want our players throwing their dice across the room in a fit of hunger-induced rage. So how do we strike that balance?
That's where the next layer of mechanics comes in establishing food quality and its effects. The article suggests a tiered system: common good, rare, and magical.
Okay, I'm seeing a whole culinary spectrum here. Common food, that's your basic rations, keeping you alive, but not much else, right?
Exactly. Think trail mix, hardtack, that kind of thing. Then you have good food, heartier meals that provide some minor benefits.
Ooh, like a hearty stew that gives you a bonus to your next strength check. Or a cup of strong coffee that lets you stay awake for an extra watch.
Exactly. It's a way to reward players for their cleverness and resourcefulness without completely breaking the game.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. What about rare food? This is where things get fancy, right?
Think exotic ingredients, masterfully prepared dishes, maybe even meals with a touch of mystical energy.
Like a feast at a royal court where every dish grants a temporary buff for advantage. Or maybe stumbling on a grove of enchanted fruit that grants temporary hit points.
Now you're getting it. Rare food adds a layer of excitement and wonder to your world. And finally, we have magical food, the rarest and most potent of them all.
All right, hit me with the magic mushrooms and enchanted wine. What kind of fantastical effects are we talking about here?
Think meals that grant temporary spells, potions disguised as delicious desserts, or even food blessed by powerful beings.
Okay, now we're talking about game changers.
Yeah.
That's got to be carefully balanced though, right? Too much magical food and every campaign turns into a cakewalk.
You're absolutely right. The key is to use these potent foods sparingly as rewards for exceptional cleverness or daring, or as plot devices that drive the narrative forward.
I like it. It's all about those memorable moments and unexpected twists. But I've got to ask, with all this talk about fancy meals and magical feasts, what about the simple act of hunting and gathering?
That's where the article gets really granular, and I think this is where it'll be most valuable for you as a DM. It dives into specific mechanics for foraging and hunting, incorporating terrain-type difficulty levels, and even tying it all back to character skills and abilities.
Okay, I am ready to roll some dice for survival. Give you the juicy details. How do we make foraging and hunting more than just an afterthought in our campaigns?
Imagine your players are trekking through a dense forest. This is where foraging really comes alive. Instead of just saying, you find some berries, you turn it into a skill challenge.
Okay, I like where this is going. My players are on-edge eyes scanning the undergrowth. What kind of challenge am I throwing at them?
Let's have them make wisdom survival checks to find edible plants. But with varying degrees of success, a low roll might mean they find enough berries to stave off hunger. Nothing special, but a higher roll. That could uncover rare mushrooms with unique properties, maybe even a hidden beehive.
Ooh, I love the honey idea. A sweet reward, literally. Makes it feel like their actions have real consequences.
Exactly. And don't forget about the risks. A critical failure on that survival check could mean accidentally eating poisonous berries or disturbing a hornet's nest. Suddenly, foraging isn't just a walk in the park.
Adds a nice element of danger. I like it. But what about hunting? My party's got a ranger who fancies themselves a bit of a master tracker.
This is where those character abilities really shine. The article even calls this out. A ranger with the favored enemy feature, which, by the way, gives them bonuses against certain creature types, would have a much easier time tracking and hunting in their favored terrain.
So it's not just about slapping on a new set of rules, it's weaving them into the existing mechanics.
Clever. Right. It makes those character choices feel even more meaningful. And you can get so creative with it. Maybe a cunning rogue uses their stealth skills to set traps for small game, or a powerful fighter goes head-to-head with a fearsome beast.
Suddenly those monster manual entries aren't just about combat, they're potential meals. Adds a whole new dimension.
Speaking of dimensions, let's not forget the impact of the environment itself. The article suggests using different terrain types to create distinct challenges. Think about a desert where water is scarce and finding sustenance is a constant struggle. Or a frozen wasteland where even keeping warm is a feat.
Okay, this is all making sense. But how do we take these concepts and apply them to those classic D&D dungeon crawls? Those are kind of a staple, you know?
Well, instead of just worrying about traps and monsters, now your party needs to consider their food and water supplies as they delve deeper. That sense of dwindling resources really heightens the tension.
I can see it now. Every crumb of bread, every drop of water becomes precious. Suddenly, that moldy cheese doesn't seem so bad after all.
Exactly. And think about those exhaustion mechanics. A long, winding dungeon filled with puzzles, traps, and challenging encounters. It all takes a toll.
It's like those survival horror games, but with more mimics and less jump scares.
The article even suggests weaving exhaustion triggers into the dungeon itself. Imagine a chamber filled with hallucinogenic gas that inflicts exhaustion just by breathing it in.
Ooh, that's creepy. It's like the dungeon is messing with their minds as much as their body.
Or a trap that doesn't cause physical damage, but drains the character's energy, leaving them vulnerable to the next threat.
I'm digging these ideas. It forces the party to be smart strategic and maybe pack a few extra torches. But with all this talk about danger and depletion, how do we handle recovery? We don't want the whole campaign to feel like a slow death march.
Excellent point. Recovery becomes even more rewarding and engaging with these rules. Instead of just saying you rest for 8 hours, you create opportunities within the story itself.
Okay, I'm listening. How do we weave rest and recuperation into the narrative without feeling forced?
Imagine your exhausted party stumbles upon a hidden oasis within a dungeon, a place of tranquility where they can truly recharge. Or perhaps they discover an ancient shrine dedicated to a god of healing, and performing a ritual restores their vitality.
Ooh, I like that. It's not just about mechanics, it's about tying it all back to the world and its lore.
Precisely. And think about the role-playing potential in those moments. The party might debate which deity to appeal to, or argue about how to perform the ritual correctly.
Suddenly, that long rest turns into a whole side quest in itself.
Brilliant. You know, one thing that's been nagging at me through all this, we're talking a lot about rules and mechanics, but isn't D&D at its heart about those character-driven stories? Do these rules really mesh with that?
They absolutely do. In fact, I'd argue they enhance those character-driven moments. Think about it. Your party's trapped in a blizzard, supplies are low, exhaustion is setting in. This is where the real personalities come out.
Okay, I'm picturing it. The tough barbarian who normally hogs all the rations is now sharing his last bit of jerky with the frail wizard.
Exactly. Or the stoic ranger, who usually keeps to themselves, risks their own safety to hunt for food for the group. These rules create opportunities for those acts of selflessness and camaraderie that really bind a party together.
It's not just about surviving the dungeon, it's about surviving with each other. I like it.
And don't underestimate the power of exhaustion in those traumatic moments. Imagine a character pushing themselves to the absolute limit to protect their friends collapsing from exhaustion, but knowing they did everything they could. That's the hero stuff right there. It shows the real cost of those heroic actions. Makes you wonder if those bards are singing about the wrong parts of the adventure.
Perhaps. You know, we've talked about survival challenges, even heroism. But what about the mystery and intrigue that make for a good story? Can these rules fit into that kind of narrative?
Good question. I'm all about weaving a good yarn. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, we've all had those sessions where the mystery's like all about a stolen artifact or a cryptic prophecy. How do food and exhaustion fit into that picture?
They can actually become central to the plot. Imagine a noble lord poisoned at a grand feast. Your players need to investigate each elaborate dish, track down exotic ingredients, maybe even question the chef's guild to uncover the culprit.
Ooh, that's a fun twist on the classic whodunit. It's not just about gathering clues. It's about understanding the culinary landscape of the world.
Exactly. Or think about a powerful artifact hidden within a legendary feast hall, guarded by ghostly chefs and animated cutlery. Suddenly, those cooking utensils take on a whole new meaning.
That's straight out of a fairy tale. But with much higher stakes. I can see my players sweating as they try to decipher a recipe while dodging enchanted cleavers.
And let's not forget those exhaustion mechanics. They can create a real sense of urgency. Imagine the party racing against time to find a cure for a magical plague, their exhaustion levels rising with each passing hour as the symptoms worsen.
Now that's how you create a ticking clock that resonates with the players.
Yeah.
They're not just worried about their character's hit points. They're worried about succumbing to the fatigue and making a mistake that could cost lives.
And speaking of those critical decisions, this brings us to another layer of depth these rules can add, the impact on character choices.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
As a DM, I love when mechanics can really force those tough moral dilemmas.
Imagine this. The party needs to reach a distant city to deliver a vital message, but their supplies are dwindling and their exhaustion levels are sky high. Do they risk pushing themselves further, putting their own well-being on the line for the greater good? Or do they prioritize their own survival, potentially at the cost of failing the mission?
Wow, that's a real gut punch of a choice. It's not just about rolling dice. It's about role-playing those internal struggles.
Yeah.
And grappling with the consequences.
And those are the moments that stick with players long after the session ends. They'll remember those tough calls and how their characters responded under pressure.
You know, as you're talking, I'm realizing these homebrew rules aren't just about adding complexity. They're about adding meaning.
Exactly. They're a way to make those everyday actions. Eating, sleeping, traveling feel just as significant as fighting a dragon or solving an ancient riddle.
So as we wrap up Deep Dive, I have to ask, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think it's this. Don't be afraid to experiment. These rules are a framework, a starting point. Take them, adapt them, tweak them to fit your world and your style.
Don't just feed your players. Feed their imaginations. I love it.
And remember, balance is key. Introduce these mechanics gradually. Get feedback from your players. And most importantly, have fun with it.
This has been an absolutely fantastic deep dive. I'm already scribbling notes and brainstorming new ways to incorporate these ideas into my campaigns. Thanks so much for sharing your insights.
It's been a pleasure. I'm always excited to talk about D&D and all the creative ways we can make this game even more immersive and engaging.
And of course, another shout out to Paul Bello, that fine fellow, for sending us this article. You've given us a real feast for thought.
Indeed. And speaking of feasts, we'd love to hear from you, our listeners. How do you incorporate food and survival into your D&D games? Do you have any homebrew rules or memorable culinary moments you want to share?
Leave us a comment below and let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, may your dice rolls be ever in your favor and may your rations never run out.